I've been given today is an incredibly daunting one. I have had to follow the most amazing collection of speakers. Every one of them has caught my breath, put me in awe, made me rethink what I ought to be talking about at the end of the day. I would have loved to go away and write after every one of them. So it's been an awful journey in a way, listening to these amazing things I wanted to totally indulge myself in and just dwell in for a while, also recognizing that somehow at the end of the day I was going to have to try and get up and say something thoughtful and intelligent. And I'm also aware that the particular topic that I have been entrusted with, shall we say, at the end of the day is a little bit different than some of the others. And so it doesn't have that gorgeous, heartfelt, sort of warm, fuzzy, caring kind of thing that we've just been soaking up here. But I hope you will hear it as something that perhaps is complementary, and hopefully I can bring it to some conclusion that's really relevant. But we've all been asked to be provocative with ideas and engage a dialogue, and to try and be part of this community advancing the knowledge of the ideas of caring science. This is an occasion also for all of us to reflect on extending the work that Anne Boykin, the wonderful Anne Boykin, has done, who's contributed so much to the heart and soul of this whole business of caring. Really played a huge role over all of these years in helping us understand how nursing theory can be personal, not simply abstract, and knowing oneself as a caring person, focusing not toward a concrete end such as an objective health or wellness, but some kind of way of being and living in the world. So all of us collectively in this Boykin tradition as we gather today are adding to this debate about nursing and all of its various interpretations of theorizing and enaction. Moving beyond those mathematical models of propositions to a way of conceptualizing nursing that actually preserves this holistic and expressive integrity that everyone has been talking about today in different languages and different ways. So the context for this conversation, and certainly Richard alluded to this, where it is engaged in debates on the theoretical issues, our profession has had a really nasty tendency to make many of these ideological. And by that I mean some of the polarizing and demonizing debates establishing paradigmatic camps of supposedly mutually exclusive ways of thinking about nursing, which I, of course, see as a misread on Thomas Kuhn, who, positioned it in a useful way at the time as the old farts and the new enlightened people. And we've taken that a bit extremely. So we've tended to create clubs and communities of like-minded thinkers that increasingly set up these sharp distinctions between those who are inside and outside. And we've done this using language and reference points and different signifiers of common language. And like many of you, I'm sure, I'm weary of these polarizing ideological bun fights. And while they were lively and perhaps fun and created a spark of interest when we were doctoral students, I think they've also been unnecessarily divisive and not all that good for our profession's cohesiveness, integrity, and common sense and purpose. I see Boykin as a thinker who has modeled welcoming that debate and brought people together who she has trusted to provoke us, push us individually, and bring us into this, what we've all had here as a treasured day of wrestling with ideas so that we can all leave richer and more impassioned about this common purpose of ours. So my part in taking up this challenge is going to be to try and position the work of those in the caring science field within an evidentiary context. We've all been hearing about that as one of the examples of good guys and bad guys. So I hope to propose some ideas about how to think about all of this, pushing our thinking toward what I consider one of the most important ideational contexts of our time, and that's the evidence imperative. And the way we speak and think about evidence, the language of talking about the evidence of what we do. So a few comments about nursing frameworks to begin. And regardless of our theoretical tradition, we all live in a world in which there are commonalities to the core of this tradition. And we are all nurses, I include Ray in that. We resonate with the same core values and aspirations, regardless of the curriculum within which we learned it, the theoretical model we use to organize our practice thinking. And the theoretical model is, after all, just a conceptual framework, much like an architectural plan. And even radically different architectural plans can lead to the building of things we would still recognize as houses. And the worth of a house for its intended purpose will evolve and grow as the humans inhabit it. So that original framework really does become just one small component of making the house be what it eventually can be. And just as the frameworks by which we structure our progress toward becoming a nurse don't ever constrain what we're capable of throughout our professional careers, they do and can focus us on that core. And despite all, across the frameworks, there are some ways in which all of them allow for the idea and the possibility of wholes and parts in their appropriate times and the intricate relationship between them. And they teach us about commonalities and differences as the context for understanding human health and illness. And they emphasize the role of ideas, not simply tasks, as we've heard so many times today, as the context for coming to know what we know as the basis for this applied practice profession. And they orient us to the nature of nursing thinking, which is inevitably, necessarily, processual, systematic, flexible, and infinitely adaptive. And so theoretical thinking in nursing always orients us to attention on this old saw, shall we say, the client or person, health, environment for that health, and nursing. And obviously not in a way that makes them mutually exclusive. With a specific emphasis, much of our theoretical work on the nature of that person, particularly when he or she is under the microscope or the target or client, as a client of our profession's attention. And all these nursing frameworks and theories orient us to the idea that there are knowledge options for understanding that person, that there is never only one possible way to think about what's going on and what it might mean. And that's a hallmark of what we do. So that said, we never operate in a vacuum. And I think one of the most important contexts in which we operate today is this evidence imperative, evidence being the truth claims of our particular era. And we know why evidence is necessary. Frankly, it is the only thing known to be able to stop poor practices. The classic we always refer to is unnecessary radical mastectomy. And the intentionality of those surgeons who were engaging in that practice was incontestable. Their hearts and souls were believing what they were doing. We need to recognize intentionality alone would never have solved that particular problem. That just being an example. We heard today about antidepressant diagnosis, for example. That kind of thing that we might consider poor practice can only be stopped by evidence. So it is quite important to think about all of the things that once were embedded in our structure that people with good intention engaged in have to interact with evidence in order to stop them. So I think this is and is going to continue to be an incredibly important context for all of us. So the decisions we make are going to be based on high quality evidence. Not to be naive about politics, if we as a discipline are going to have an influence on the policy world that affects healthcare, we need to do that within the evidence world. But if that's the case, we need to be very, very clear on what evidence entails and what it doesn't entail. So there is a legal definition of evidence, and that legal definition refers to the idea of a weight of a body of evidence in which various bits of things, some of them quite flimsy and some of them quite solid, are all part of what constitutes that weight. So we're not necessarily evaluating the worth of any individual bit of the thing. The rules as to what gets included in that body of evidence have to do with other things, like whether it's legal to include it, whether hearsay should be included, for example. So it's a very different set of rules about how to think about evidence in which all things inclusible are put into the body and we then look at the weight. So the weight is, the balance is on the collective rather than the nature of any particular piece of evidence. And this contrasts rather dramatically, I think, with what we think of, although I'm being overly simplistic, I'm doing it to make a point, about scientific evidence, which does have to do with a hierarchy, the kinds of evidence that will trump other kinds of evidence. And in the mastectomy example, you can really imagine why it is that you would need 10 minutes already. Why you would need randomized controlled trials to have the capacity to exert this sufficient force on the expert who thinks he's doing the right thing. The only way really to stop the craziness that we've been referring to will sometimes be this hard evidence. So in the health science world, the evidence claim is not the legal one in which everything potentially has equal value, but the scientific one in which the highest forms of publicly interpretable and synthesizable science count and will inevitably overrule the others. It doesn't necessarily dominate a decision, but it does create warrants for this kind of languaging around evidence. And in nursing, we have a long and lively tradition of attaching the word evidence or best evidence to all kinds of knowledges, regardless of their nature. And the second sin, using the term evidence to lend credibility to all of our claims. Our evidence definitions reflect our discipline's characteristic democratic generosity that allows us to end up with a position that evidence can essentially be what any nurse says it is. With these claims of evidence, we can see how each of these knowledge forms, if you look in your textbook, sometimes the ones we even use for our beginning students, each of these knowledge forms can be referred to as a form of evidence. Qualitative explorations, ethical theorizing, pattern recognition, and in some cases, even patient preference will be listed in that list. So the discourses around evidence in our discipline are really quite highly problematic. We say things like, the evidence shows, I haven't seen. And although this has been a remarkable conversation in this last day and a half, that we haven't been falling into this trap, I'm sure you will have seen it among your colleagues, but we do sometimes still revert to, it is a fact that. We make indirect references to this evidence. Nursing classic logic is that evidence is only one form of knowledge. My practice derives from many forms of knowledge. Evidence-based practice is best practice. My practice, of course, is excellent quality, so therefore all forms of evidence that I use must be considered evidence. And this slide, as you may have seen, logic is another thing that Pegans aren't very good at. So I'm poking fun at us here, but of course nurses are not illogical people, and our discipline does not want to position us collectively as an illogical segment of the healthcare spectrum. So I think it becomes important to consider why we're using this problematic evidence language by reflecting on the many other ways there are of thinking about the question of how we know what we know. We're all aware of an incredibly rich tradition that we have in talking about ways of knowing. And just think about, when we talk about impact factors, just think about the impact of Barbara Carper's dissertation. And all of the things that have been done beyond the original four to do justice to the many ways of thinking that we have about this profound problem. We've all realized that our particular kind of knowledge must necessarily extend well beyond the kinds of questions for which empirical science has answered. And in this way, empirical knowledge has to be just one of our knowledge forms. We actually have a strong and healthy tradition of explicitly distinguishing those forms of knowledge from evidence and celebrating the contributions they make. In addition to this empirical evidence in the complex world of engaging in matters of human health and illness, and my goodness, our conversations have been rife with this. And this group, I think, has shown tremendous leadership in sometimes positioning that against evidence rather than being within that conversation. And remember that Carper's use of this language around the problem of applied knowledge actually predated the use of evidence-based terminology, which did not really appear in the literature until the 1980s. So she was wrestling with the same kinds of intellectual challenges that people like Archie Cochrane and Albert Feinstein had been struggling with in trying to understand medical decision-making as an intensely complex process. And so I actually believe we must come to accept that we can't simultaneously celebrate our discipline's capacity to think in these complex ways and also revert to a singular term to narrow down or dumb down what we communicate about the knowledge that shapes our practice. And at the same time, I actually appreciate that nursing has a healthy suspicion about the dominance of empirical evidence as the basis for healthcare decisions. So we know that science has its own known nature. This has been referred to several times today, and there are implications to that nature. It's inherently tied to a conceptualization of reductionist science with all of its limitations. And although that nature is intertwined with philosophy, it has become sufficiently codified and systematized that is nowadays we often position it in direct contradistinction to philosophy. And as the investigation, as you would know in this country, of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986 clearly showed, and many other investigations have since demonstrated, the problem with science really is that the more incontestable the evidence seems to be, the more likely we are to make major and fundamental mistakes in relation to it. We know that the best evidence can also lead to illusions of invulnerability, collective rationalization, and disinhibit creative and critical thinking. And so this kind of false assurance with big science narrows the vision and perpetuates the interests of those with motivations other than the humanity and goodwill we've been talking about. So these are very complex issues, and it's not in our interest to complicate what we do by inadvertently rendering all of what we know into that form of evidence. So when we attempt to dignify all forms of knowledge that we use by calling them evidence, when we language this complexity of knowledge in this manner, we are really placing our profession at some risk. We're using it in ways that the term in ways that are not understood outside of the profession. We're setting ourselves up for looking like we don't understand science. We reduce the likelihood that our scientific contributions will be taken up outside the discipline. And we increasingly actually risk harm to actual patients if we allow ourselves to reference as evidence those kinds of things for which empirical knowledge is unavailable or inappropriate, simply to be persuasive. So we all know that a very high priority in healthcare today is helping patients deconstruct false evidence claims. We're entering into that world in which this is the lived experience of everybody with a new condition, and conversations are happening in that world so strongly. So this challenge is something we should be building into our curricula, that we need to understand, and we need to be able to reflect on it ourselves. We need to recognize that by not thinking about it seriously, we're simply entering into that marketing campaign with our evidence being more compelling than the toothpaste evidence or the online evidence. So what are those alternatives for conceptualizing this thing? Is it possible to think about evidence as a property of a particular form of science so that we can clarify its role and scope more clearly in guiding this thing we call evidence-based practice or evidence-informed practice? Well, to do this, I think we need to form some real clarity of thought about the kind of knowledge that should be included. Things like justified true beliefs, systemic processes, epistemological premises of propositional knowledge, phenomenal aspects of reality, influenced by additional non-evidential forms of knowledge. In this way, evidence can be understood as a particular subset of the available knowledge upon which we make our practice decisions to be used in the appropriate manner in alignment with equally thoughtful, appropriate use of other knowledge forms. In this way, I think we can begin to reconstruct this philosophical core of our discipline as the driving force. Because we're much more sophisticated in our thinking than we were during the heyday of the theorizing movement, we can move away from what I consider a misnomer of nursing theory and properly claim this work as our ontological, epistemological, and methodological tradition, within which empirical science is relevant, but never, ever the whole. And so once we do this, perhaps we can ban the use of the term clinical evidence permanently and only use that E word when we really mean it. It's a core ingredient of this to meet the need within the discipline that the term clinical evidence used to fill. We need to be very thoughtful about the nature of clinical epistemology. What are the many ways we come to know about our patients? On the left-hand side, I'm making reference here of only one component to be that which comes from rigorous study of other people. And that general knowledge always has to be taken up for the purpose of nursing with very distinctive thought processes, analytic processes, and aims in view. And it doesn't get to be informed clinical practice until it has passed through the very powerful curtain of our critical thinking. Because of this, theoretical integrity in the evidence discourse requires that we develop this centrality of this capacity for critical thinking on such things as knowledge sources and applications, to develop a more formal role for philosophical theorizing across the spectrum of what we're thinking of when we're working with knowledge in an informed way. And here we see the incredibly important role for caring science as a way of conceptualizing this non-evidentiary form of knowledge that's situated firmly in the center of this picture. We can see that there are challenges that we're going to have to continue to wrestle with because of having landed on language that may have been intended to strengthen the relationship of our various knowledge to science, but may now be limiting us to this more narrow idea that caring is science or can be studied in ways that we consider empirical. This will be quite a challenge for those of you who work in the world that you might call caring science and who want to build its philosophical and not just evidentiary credibility. We need to ensure that we attend to the idea of using the language like caring philosophy, since there will always be so much to this caring, the core of our discipline, so much that's bigger than what evidence could ever possibly provide. And these non-evidentiary kinds of claims about individual experiences and subjectivities, about power dynamics, about transformative capacity, about ethical and moral tensions, and about relational practice, they will require discipline capable of understanding and controlling that critical thinking or the capacity to handle ideas, a domain in which we collectively refer to when we use the language of caring science, that will have the most to offer, not as a competitor to conventional population-based science, but as a complementary knowledge that allows us to professionally and defensively translate these ideas into practice. Because that world of conventional evidence always and inevitably privileges that general over the particular, it's no accident that nurses have always wanted to disrupt the power of that which can be measured and calculated by searching out knowledge processes that can help them encounter and challenge population evidence and get them closer to what it means to work at the world of the individual, that interface where nursing is enacted at the core. Whatever we call it, Richard might refer to it as appreciative unitary practice, Janet to the healing practice of healing. And so it makes sense that nurses have taken such leadership in this application of qualitative methodologies within the health domain, because they sense that the qualitative approach will get them closer to disciplinary knowledge they need to filter out evidentiary science, always the population in general, as they determine whether and how any of this knowledge would apply to the case of any one individual patient. And while qualitative research can answer some of the population or general questions we might pose, its real strength will never be in building science per se in that way, but most especially in helping us think through how to apply it. It's a blunt and confusing instrument for any consideration of anything like causality and prevalence, but used thoughtfully, it can finely tune our focus on the dynamics of how individuals might work and how we might understand the particularities that we encounter. I'm referring here to the kind of qualitative research that's not attempting to produce a product it thinks of as empirical evidence, or it refers to as empirical evidence. And it also is not the kind that draws so heavily on the theoretical imperative of the socialist science, whose tradition is for theorizing. But it's a kind of applied qualitative research that many people have been talking about, using language like qualitative description, Sandolowski's term, interpretive description, interpretive phenomenology, Benner's term, all of which explicitly understand the disciplinary perspective as the theoretical scaffolding, reclaiming that disciplinary core philosophy as grounding our qualitative research. And I hope that this will be the next major development in our thinking as a discipline, to align the methodologies by which we study things with the fundamental philosophical understandings we are forming about the distinctive epistemological nature of our discipline and its relationship to the world of empirical science. So overcoming these great barriers between our epistemologies and our methodologies. So to sum up, I think we're on the brink of positioning the judicious application of this knowledge derived from the profound philosophical structures that we need when we use this language of caring science and when we position it in the context of evidence-based practice. I think we're on the edge of developing more thoughtful and meaningful ways than we have to date, and boy, today has been such a case exemplar in that. And we're using methods that are often designed to get at the species of knowledge and to name it in ways that are true to its nature, but not limiting ourselves to thinking about relevant knowledge as evidence. I think by this, we will be able to see the possibility of a truly logical, coherent, and communicable form of the disciplinary wisdom that stands firmly in support of the people we serve and the unique role we play in serving them. We're not living in the world of testable theories, but livable philosophies. And there's so much potential in the world of nursing ideas, and I am so incredibly gratified to have had this opportunity to spend this period of time with you and to be in this career at a time when so many of these ideas are happening, when there are forums like this, when we can come together to have these conversations and to witness this really, truly important advance in our disciplinary wisdom. I think that if we continue to think together about the role of this caring science and this larger community of conversation that is evolving, it is not going to make the evidence-based world go away. It probably needs to rely on the capacity of some in our midst to be doing thoughtfully aimed evidence that can counter some of these practices we want to stop. But when we stop those practices, we will have so much to fill in. So thanks so much for including me in this marvelous conversation, and I look forward to your questions and comments.